Nebraska has a long history of creepy places and strange and mysterious sightings of creatures. Some of these places are downright terrifying, like the colony of albino cannibals living in Hummel Park. It's terrifying to say the least. There are ghosts, Indian burial grounds, and cults attached to this land. There have been so many murders there that I can't believe they actually built a park here. It's considered to be one of the most haunted parks in the United States. The legend is that there are a group of albino people living somewhere in the woods within the park. If you're at the park at night, these cannibals will emerge from the trees and kill you and eat you. Just gruesome. But that's not what we're talking about in this episode. We are here to go over all of the strange sightings of creatures that people have experienced in Nebraska. Dawes County. I am writing this on behalf of my father-in-law. On October 29th, 2006, he, his wife, and a friend were hiking on the Lookout Trail in Chadron State Park. Walking east, they came to a place where the trail takes a sharp turn to the south. As they rounded the turn, my father-in-law's friend looked towards the north and noticed someone or something standing on top of the limestone ridge. This was about 200 to 300 yards away. He stopped my father-in-law and pointed out the figure to him. Even from that distance, they could tell that there was something very unusual about the features of this figure. It was very tall and covered from head to toe in black fur. They watched it for 5 minutes as it stood on the ridge, and it swayed back and forth before it casually walked behind a limestone outcrop and disappeared into the pine forest. They have no idea what this creature is that they witnessed. The only reasonable explanation they could come up with is, since that it's so close to Halloween, someone was running around the forest in a gorilla costume. But this area is extremely remote. It's a combination of national forest land and Nebraska State Park land. And this explanation, although plausible, is highly unlikely. DAKOTA County. In September 1998, my brother-in-law, his girlfriend, and I, which wished to remain anonymous, were walking down the gravel road that I lived on. It was about 2 a.m. We were about a mile away from my house, and we smelled this horrible smell. Almost like the smell of something dead, but stronger. We looked around, but couldn't see anything considering how dark it was. We walked a little bit further and decided to turn around and go home. As we came across the spot that smelled so bad, we noticed that there was no smell anymore, so we decided to look around a little bit more. On both sides of the road were ditches that were about 8 to 10 feet deep. We walked over to the side of the road where we originally smelled that horrific smell. As we got to the edge of the road, a creature that looked to be about 7 to 8 feet tall suddenly stood up. It was very dark that night, but the creature looked to be the size of a grizzly bear. But there are no bears in the area that I live in. Needless to say, it scared the hell out of us, and my brother-in-law's girlfriend screamed, and the creature took off running, as did we. As we were running back home, we saw 3 deer in the cornfield near the road. I slowed down for a second and watched them. Then I heard this extremely loud screeching, kind of a howling sound. I wasn't sure what it was or what we saw or heard that night. I never mentioned anything till now for fear or criticism, but I'm now a believer that there is something out there. Douglas County. We live near Omaha, Nebraska. I'm speaking on behalf of my mother. My mother first saw this thing when she was 10 years old. You have to understand the way the neighborhood we live in is set up. The house my mother lived in when she was 10 is less than a quarter of a mile away from the house that she lives in today. All of the yards in that neighborhood are sort of connected with somewhat of a gully in the middle. The first time my mother had any knowledge of this thing, her sister and her were swinging on a double tire swing in her backyard. The next thing my mother knew, her sister had jumped off the swing and was running and screaming. My mom didn't know what to do, so she ran after her sister into the house. Her sister was hysterical, saying that she saw something in the back wooded area of their yard. I guess my grandpa did find some sort of large footprints. This was the first incident. The next incident was when my mom was outside of her house when she was young. She saw a large thing covered in hair walking across her driveway. My mom told me that the thing walked as almost if it was bow-legged. She also said that its shoulders moved from side to side as it walked. Now, my mother lives in the house I grew up in. As recently as a few weeks ago, something has been seen in my mother's backyard. It has only been seen by my mother, but also by my sister, who frequently stays at my mom's house. About 3 years ago is when my mom had her most vivid and frightening encounter with this thing. She was letting the dogs out in the backyard, and they both went barreling towards the fence surrounding our yard. My mom walked out into the yard, thinking nothing other than the dogs were just being dogs, and was standing there waiting for them to go to the bathroom. It was then when she noticed something moving into the next yard. She said it was about 7 or 8 feet tall and standing behind a tree. She said as fast as the dogs had ran to the fence barking, they were running back to the house yelping. My mom said she froze. She always tells me the fear that she feels when she sees this thing. It's overwhelming. She said it then leaped from behind one tree to another. That's when she started running. She said she looked behind her and it was now coming towards her. So she ran in the house and locked the doors. My mom lives in a brick house, and she also told me that on occasion she will hear something that sounds like beating or throwing itself up against the side of her house. We don't know what to do, but we definitely need some help. Gage County. While traveling southbound on Highway 77 near Blue Springs, Nebraska, I encountered a very large creature standing upright. As I came around a gentle curve in the road, this creature stepped out of the ditch on my side of the road and with one stride was up on the roadbed, and within 2 more strides was across and going down into the ditch on the other side. A car coming the other way also saw this. We both slowed down to a crawl as we came to this spot. I asked if they saw something. They responded they did. I was most impressed with the girth of this creature's legs and torso. It was massive and much taller than a human. I would estimate it to weigh 600 or 700 pounds. The body was covered in a medium-length blackish brown hair, and the face appeared to be less hairy. I was not close enough to see any facial features. The arms swung normally, but they were much longer than a man's. The quick stride and the movement was what impressed me the most, along with the sheer mass. HOLT County. In the fall of 1974, I was bow hunting for deer near HOLT County. Not seeing any signs of deer in the area I was in, I decided to move and try another spot. I drove east along the river on a road where there is somewhat steep dirt cliffs and wooded floodplains with swamps and marshes to the north. There are several ravines and creeks which flow into the river from the south. About 5 or 6 miles east of the river, there was an area that allowed people to hunt. I hunted this area, but I left before dark because my car was not too dependable, and I didn't want to get stranded after dark. Driving back home, I decided to look for deer in the ravines. When I looked into the ravine, I saw this large figure about 40 or 50 feet away. It was very tall and had this coal-colored hair, about 3 to 4 inches in length all over its body. I could only see it from about the knees up. Its face was more human and lighter in color, kind of like a tan color. I couldn't tell if it was skin or just very short hair on its face. It almost had nothing for a neck. It looked right at me for like 2 seconds. Then it turned around and ran on 2 feet up the ravine. As it turned, I could see its muscles in its upper back. They were ripped. This thing had to be super strong. When it ran, it made very little noise. I would guess this thing to weigh over 500 pounds. I got the feeling that this thing was traveling to the river. I sat there parked for a few minutes trying to put everything in order. I decided not to tell anyone because I didn't think anyone would believe me anyways. Many years later, I did tell a few friends and they just laughed. I know it's been a long time, but I can just see this thing in my mind. It's just one of those things. Knox County. I saw this large figure approximately 40 yards away, standing on the edge of a ravine. How tall it was difficult to estimate because I was standing a little downhill, but it was very large. It had gray hair over its entire body. It's very muscular and a thick neck. It was standing very erect, turning its head from side to side as if it was trying to smell for something. It looked directly at me and I ducked down. When I looked again, there was nothing there. A friend of mine was in a deer stand approximately a mile away as the crow flies, down the ravine in the direction which I thought it went. He told me that I wouldn't believe what ran by his deer stand. He described to me the same thing that I saw. He was very upset. Lancaster County. A man on a motorcycle turned off 27th Street onto Fairfield Street, just in front of the Lincoln Electric Company. He said a massive creature ran out in front of him, causing him to fall. The creature proceeded south towards Salt Creek about a half a block. This area at the time was very isolated. Now there are buildings everywhere, and the city limits have been moved back considerably. It was in the papers the next day. We lived about a half a mile up Fairfield Street. I remember not wanting to go outside in the neighborhood at night for a while. My kids were still young, so it must have been around 15 years ago. At the time of the sighting, there was mostly farmland. The guy was so scared he continued on his way after he got up from the fall. He also said it just smelled terrible. He reported it as a gigantic ape-like creature that was standing upright. Saline County. I was on Highway 15 just approaching Highway 33. There was a highway light and some yard lights from a farmhouse. As I was approaching Highway 33, something came out of the ditch on my side and with one stride came right up to my car and stared at me as I went by. As I slowed down for the stop sign, I looked in the rearview mirror and it was standing in the middle of the road looking at me. Sorry, I didn't stop. I called my fiance at the time, now my husband, and I was hysterical. He called the state troopers, and the dispatch said this isn't the first time that we've had this type of report. This thing was very large. All I saw was eyes on top of this massive body. It scared the hell out of me. Sarpy County. The following occurred in 1975 when I was 14 years old. My family lived in Bellevue, Nebraska, where my father had recently retired from the U.S. Air Force after 24 years of active duty. This was a series of 3 encounters over a 3-day period. Let me provide a little background. My girlfriend lived on the next block over. Our houses were separated by a field with a strand of trees from the north side of the field. The strand of trees was approximately 20 feet wide at the time, and it ran from east to west. On the east side of Bellevue Boulevard was a heavily forested area that was either part of or bordered Fontanelli Forest. I would go over to my girlfriend's house and visit until it was time for me to go back home. At that time, my curfew was 10 p.m. during the summer. The first incident occurred as I was crossing the field on my way home. It was around 10 p.m. at night. I was walking in a northwest direction with a thick strand of trees to my right. I heard heavy footfalls and occasional snapping of branches within the trees. Whatever was within the trees was following me. When I stopped, it stopped. When I began walking, it began walking. It was very dark in the field and I couldn't see anything. After several stops and starts, I became extremely frightened and ran the rest of the way across the field, climbed over my 4-foot chain link fence that surrounded our backyard, ran up our backyard and into the house. The second incident happened the very next night. This occurrence happened exactly the same as the first one did. And the final incident happened on the third night. As I crossed the field again, I heard heavy footfalls and snapping of small branches within the strand of trees. However, this time I was not being followed. This thing was heading in a southwest direction in order to cut me off. I could hear it getting closer, but I couldn't see anything because of the darkness. As I approached, I began to smell this foul odor. The odor was so strong it almost made me gag. By now, the footfalls were very near. I could feel this thing cross in front of me, but I couldn't see anything. The footfalls were now on my left. At this point, I became extremely frightened and began running across the field. I'm not sure, but I suspect I cleared our 4-foot fence without even touching it. About halfway up the hill of my backyard, I stopped. I can't explain why I did this, but I simply felt compelled to do so. I turned around and saw what had crossed my path. The backyard and a portion of the field was nicely illuminated by a floodlight that my father had just put on the back of the house. Standing at the edge of the field, next to our clothesline, was a creature on 2 legs. It was covered in dark brown hair. It stood about 7 feet tall, and the reason why I know this is because our clothesline was 6 feet in height, and its head was about a foot above the clothesline. I was about 30 yards from it, but I couldn't make out any facial features. But I do recall that its eyes were glowing. The thing was extremely thick across the chest. The arms hung almost to its knees, and it was very muscular. We stood there staring at each other for approximately 20 seconds before I turned to run into my house.